Fire illuminated the orbital ring, casting long shadows across the diplomatic table. Verney signed her life away with a flick of a tungsten pen. She was an aristocrat of a dying faction, traded to a monster to buy her people time. Humanity had burned half her system. Now, she belonged to one of their most feared commanders. She expected a tyrant. She expected chains. She never expected the quiet man who would later butcher 1,000 soldiers just to keep her safe. Diplomacy always tastes like ash. Verney sat rigidly in the high-backed leather chair, her spine straight enough to snap. Across the polished mahogany table sat the architects of her world's ruin. Earth Command did not look like the boogeymen the propaganda vids portrayed. They wore pressed Navy uniforms. They drank black coffee. They spoke in low, measured tones. That made them infinitely more terrifying. They had dismantled the Orion Coalition's fleet in less than 6 months without ever raising their voices. Arthur, her chief advisor, leaned in. His breath was warm and smelled faintly of peppermint. "Just sign it, Verney. Do not look at him. Just sign." Verney ignored the old man. She looked up, fixing her gaze on the man seated directly opposite her. Jonathan Reed. He was the tip of the Terran spear. Fleet Admiral, Ground Commander, the Butcher of the Outer Rim. She had expected a towering brute wrapped in power armor, sporting cybernetic eyes and a sneer. Instead, she saw a man who looked profoundly exhausted. Reed wore a simple dark suit. No medals, no ribbons. His hair was heavily salted with gray, cut close to the scalp. Deep lines bracketed his mouth, and his eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, were focused entirely on the datapad in front of him. His hands rested flat on the table. They were large hands, thick knuckles. A jagged white scar cut across the back of his left palm, disappearing under his cuff. He didn't look like a conqueror. He looked like a man waiting for a train. "The terms are clear," Admiral Bailey said, his voice echoing in the cavernous room. Bailey was an older human, sharp-eyed and restless. "The Orion Coalition surrenders all sovereign military assets. You accept Terran oversight on agricultural exports. In exchange, the orbital bombardments cease immediately. And to solidify this union, to ensure the Coalition's loyalty," Bailey paused, glancing at Reed. "A marriage, a joining of our two houses, so to speak." Verney felt her stomach twist. Medieval barbarism wrapped in bureaucratic red tape. The Terrans wanted a hostage they could parade on the home front. "I have read the terms," Verney said. Her voice was steady. She had practiced this exact tone in front of a mirror for 3 days. "I accept them on behalf of the Coalition." She picked up the stylus. It felt heavy, like it was made of lead instead of aluminum. She signed her name, Verney Turnerl, a signature that effectively ended 200 years of independent rule. Bailey smiled. It did not reach his eyes. "Excellent. Commander Reed, your signature." Reed picked up his own stylus. He didn't hesitate. He didn't savor the moment of triumph. He just scrawled his name and set the pen down. "The ceremony will be brief," Bailey continued. "Aboard this station, we depart for Earth Sector in 2 hours. Lady Verney, you will accompany your husband." Her husband. The word made her want to vomit. She looked at Reed again. He finally looked back at her. His expression was completely blank. No malice, no victory, nothing. 2 hours later, she stood in a sterile observation deck overlooking the curvature of a blue-green gas giant. A Terran chaplain rushed through a secular ceremony. Arthur stood behind her, silently weeping. Verney wore a simple gray dress, stripped of her military insignia and royal colors. Reed wore his dress uniform for the first time. It was black, devoid of the garish gold the coalition favored, but heavy with authority. "Do you, Jonathan, take Verney?" The words washed over her. She didn't listen. She stared at the bulkhead behind the chaplain, counting the rivets. 16, 17, 18. "I do," Reed said quietly. "Do you, Verney?" "I do," she lied. Reed slid a plain silver band onto her finger. His skin was rough, calloused like a common laborer's. His touch was brief and entirely devoid of warmth. When he pulled his hand away, he didn't try to hold hers. "Congratulations," the chaplain mumbled, snapping his holy book shut. "You are bound." They walked back to the docking bays in silence. 2 Terran Marines flanked them, their rifles slung across their chests. Verney kept her distance from Reed, walking close to the wall. "Your luggage has been transferred to my ship," Reed said. It was the first time he had spoken directly to her. His voice was a low, gravelly baritone. It didn't sound accustomed to much use. "I don't have much," she replied. "Your fleet's insured that." Reed didn't flinch. He didn't offer an apology. "We have a long transit. My quarters are separated. You'll have the port side suite. It locks from the inside." Verney stopped walking. She turned to look at him, her brow furrowed. "It locks from the inside?" "Yes." Reed met her gaze. "You're a political necessity, Verney, not a prisoner, and not a prize. You will have your space." He turned and continued walking down the corridor. Verney stood there for a second, watching his broad back. She didn't believe him. Men who conquered star systems didn't leave their prizes untouched. It was a trick, a psychological game to lower her defenses. She tightened her jaw, gathered the skirts of her gray dress, and followed him onto the ship. 3 weeks later, Verney found herself living in a state of suspended animation. They did not go to Earth. Instead, Reed's ship dropped out of slipspace above a rugged, largely undeveloped frontier world called New Cornwall. It was a planet of dense pine forests, jagged mountains, and endless gray oceans. Reed's estate was an isolated fortress built into the side of a cliff, overlooking a violently churning sea. It was cold, austere, and entirely utilitarian. Plasteel walls, concrete floors, minimal furniture. But there was a massive greenhouse attached to the southern wing, kept warm and humid. Verney waited for the abuse to start. She waited for him to demand his rights as a husband, or to parade her in front of his subordinates, or to lock her in a cell. None of it happened. Reed was a ghost in his own home. He woke up at 400 every day. Verney knew because she couldn't sleep, and she would hear the rhythmic, heavy thud of his boots on the treadmill in the gym downstairs. By 600, he was in the greenhouse. By 800, he was in his study, door closed, handling logistical reports for the demilitarization of her sector. They ate dinner together at 1900. It was a silent affair. Reed cooked. That was another shock. The butcher of the Outer Rim stood in front of an induction stove, carefully dicing onions and searing synthetic proteins. Tonight, the rain was lashing against the reinforced glass of the dining room. Thunder rolled off the ocean. Verney poked at her plate. It was a perfectly cooked steak. "You are very quiet," she said, finally breaking a 3-day streak of absolute silence at the dinner table. Reed looked up. He set his fork down. "I don't have much to say." You conquered 3 sectors. You broke the coalition's back in a year. I imagine you have stories." Her tone was bitter, sharp. She wanted him to react. She wanted him to show his true colors. Reed picked up his water glass, took a sip, and set it down exactly where it had been. "War isn't a story. It's an equation. We solved it. Now it's done." "It's not done for my people," Verney snapped. "They are starving. The trade embargoes—" "The embargoes are lifting next week," Reed interrupted smoothly. "I signed the authorization this morning. Medical supplies and agricultural equipment are being routed through the Saul Gate." Verney blinked. She sat back in her chair. You lifted them?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because the treaty was signed. The fighting is over. Punishing civilians doesn't stabilize a region. It breeds insurgency." He looked out the window at the dark, storm-tossed sea. "I am tired of insurgents." Verney watched him. He looked ancient in the dim light. The scars on his face and hands told of a violent past, but his demeanor was that of a weary monk. "I don't understand you," she admitted. "You don't need to," Reed said. "You just need to survive." The illusion of peace shattered exactly 4 days later. Verney was in the greenhouse, pretending to read a data pad while actually watching Reed carefully prune a row of heirloom tomatoes. His hands, so destructive, moved with surprising gentleness. Suddenly, a harsh, blaring siren cut through the quiet hum of the estate. Red emergency lighting bathed the greenhouse in a bloody glow. Reed dropped his shears. His posture changed instantly. The tired, slouching man vanished. In his place stood the soldier. His spine straightened, his head snapped toward the primary control panel on the wall. He moved with terrifying speed, his fingers dancing across the console. "What is it?" Verney asked, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Perimeter breach," Reed said. His voice was flat, cold. The baritone had hardened into iron. "Multiple drop pods entering the atmosphere. Unauthorized." He pulled up a tactical display. Dozens of red triangles were rapidly descending toward the estate. "Earth Command?" she asked, stepping closer to the screen. "No." Reed tapped the screen, magnifying a telemetry readout. "The transponder codes are spoofed, but the drop trajectory is sloppy. It's coalition." Verney felt the blood drain from her face. "My people? A splinter faction." Reed pulled up an intercepted comms packet. The voice that crackled over the speaker was familiar. It was Gregory Hale, a coalition general who had furiously opposed the surrender. "We know she's in there," Hale's voice snarled through the static. "The traitor princess. Burn the house down. Kill the Terran. Bring her head back. We don't bow to Earth." Verney stumbled backward, hitting a planter. He thinks I sold them out. He thinks I orchestrated the surrender for power." Reed didn't look at her. He was already moving toward the door. "It doesn't matter what he thinks. They have a battalion, 300 men. Light armor, kinetic rifles, standard breach protocols." 300? Verney gasped. She looked around the empty greenhouse. "Where is your garrison? Where are your guards?" "I don't have a garrison," Reed said, grabbing her arm. His grip was tight, but not painful. "I retired. Move." He dragged her through the corridors of the house. The sirens wailed. Outside, the sky was tearing open as drop pods slammed into the forest surrounding the cliffside, kicking up massive plumes of earth and shattered pine. "If you don't have guards, we need to evacuate," Verney yelled over the noise. "Call for a transport." Anti-air batteries will shoot down anything that lifts off, Reed said, pulling her into the basement. He dragged her toward a heavy, vaulted plasteel door. He punched in a 12-digit code. The door hissed open, revealing a small, reinforced panic room. Monitors lined one wall, displaying feeds from hundreds of security cameras around the property. He shoved her inside. "Stay here." "What are you doing?" she cried, grabbing the doorframe. "You can't fight 300 men, Reed. You're one person." Reed looked down at her hand on the frame. Then he looked at her face. For the first time, she saw a flicker of something in his pale blue eyes. It wasn't fear. It wasn't anger. It was a cold, absolute certainty. "I'm not going to fight them, Verney," Reed said quietly. "I'm going to exterminate them. Lock the door behind me." The heavy plasteel door slid shut, locking with a definitive metallic thud. Verney stood alone in the cool, dimly lit bunker. The screens in front of her flickered to life, offering dozens of angles of the estate and the surrounding forest. She pressed her hands to her mouth, staring at the monitors. The forest was crawling with coalition soldiers. They wore the familiar dark green armor of her home world. They moved in tight, disciplined squads. She saw tracked light tanks crushing the pine trees, their primary cannons swiveling toward the house. 300 men, heavily armed, against one aging human. It was suicide. She felt a sickening wave of guilt. They were here for her. Reed was going to die because of a political treaty he didn't even seem to care about. On monitor 4, she saw him. Reed had entered a sub-basement armory. The camera angle was high, looking down. He wasn't putting on a standard military uniform. He was stepping into an automated gantry. Verney gasped. It was a Mark 7 Wraith assault chassis. The propaganda vids back home used to terrify children with images of this armor. It was matte black, angular, and heavy. The gantry bolted the interlocking plates onto Reed's body with pneumatic hisses. The suit didn't make him a giant. It was form-fitting, designed for speed and lethal force multiplier effects rather than heavy siege. His helmet slid into place. It had no visor, just a smooth, featureless faceplate of black carbon silicate. He picked up a weapon from the rack, a heavy kinetic repeater modified with a drum magazine, and strapped a pair of vibro blades to his thighs. He didn't run. He walked. The earth shook beneath his boots, a rhythmic pounding that resonated through the reinforced steel of the bunker. She held her breath. On the exterior cameras, the first wave of coalition infantry reached the perimeter wall. They planted explosive charges. The wall blew inward in a shower of concrete dust and shrapnel. Dozens of soldiers poured through the breach, rifles raised, sweeping the courtyard. They didn't see him until it was too late. Reed stepped out of the shadows of the portico. He didn't issue a warning. He didn't demand a surrender. He simply raised the kinetic repeater and pulled the trigger. The sound, even muffled through the bunker's audio feeds, was deafening. It wasn't a laser pulse. It was the brutal, mechanical roar of depleted uranium rounds firing at 3,000 rounds per minute. The front rank of coalition soldiers simply ceased to exist. Their armor, designed to dissipate energy weapons, shattered like glass under the kinetic impact. Red mist painted the courtyard stones. "Contact! Contact!" A panicked voice screamed over the intercepted comms. "It's a Wraith! Bring up the heavy!" The voice cut off as Reed moved. Verney couldn't track him. The suit's internal servos propelled him forward with impossible speed. He wasn't a man anymore. He was a blur of black armor. He crashed into a squad taking cover behind a fountain. He didn't even use his gun. He grabbed a soldier by the chest plate and hurled him 20 feet through the air into a stone pillar. The man's neck snapped with a sickening crunch. Reed spun, drawing a vibro blade, and drove it through the helmet of the next soldier, the high-frequency weapon slicing through the composite armor like butter. Verney clamped her hands over her ears, but she couldn't tear her eyes away from the screens. A light tank breached the tree line, its turret tracking Reed. The main cannon fired. A shell the size of a man's leg ripped through the courtyard, tearing a trench in the earth. It missed. Reed had anticipated the shot. He vaulted off a crumbling wall, soaring through the air. He landed directly on top of the tank. Before the turret could track upward, he slammed his fist down onto the main hatch. The impact crumpled the heavy steel. He ripped the hatch clean off its hinges, dropped a localized fragmentation grenade inside, and kicked off the chassis. He was 50 yards away when the tank detonated from the inside out, the explosion sending a shockwave that rattled the bunker. "Fall back! Spread out!" General Hale's voice barked over the radio. He sounded terrified. "It's one man! Suppress him!" They tried. 50 rifles turned on Reed, unleashing a torrent of plasma and kinetic rounds. His black armor absorbed the hits, scoring and smoking, but he didn't slow down. He moved with a cold, terrifying efficiency. There was no wasted motion, no bravado. He was a machine performing a violent algorithm. He flanked them. He used the terrain. He drew them into a narrow choke point near the greenhouse, then triggered remote charges he must have planted years ago. The ground erupted. 30 men vanished in a geyser of fire and soil. Verney fell to her knees in the bunker, staring at the screens. She was shaking uncontrollably. She had grown up hearing stories of human brutality. Her instructors had told her that humans were animals, beasts of war. But watching Reed, she realized the truth was far worse. He wasn't an animal. Animals fought out of anger, or fear, or hunger. Reed was fighting out of absolute clinical necessity. He was dismantling an army the way a surgeon removes a tumor. Methodical, unemotional, devastating. The fight lasted less than 12 minutes. The courtyard was a slaughterhouse. Smoke choked the air. Twisted metal and broken bodies littered the meticulously maintained gardens. Out of 300 men, perhaps 20 remained, retreating blindly into the forest, throwing away their weapons in their desperation to escape. Reed didn't chase them. The feed from camera 7 showed him standing amidst the carnage. His black armor was scorched, his left shoulder pad dented, his hands dripping with dark fluid. The rain, which had finally begun to fall, hissed as it struck his overheated rifle barrel. He stood there for a long moment, chest heaving slightly. He slowly unlatched his helmet. The black faceplate slid back. He looked exactly the same as he had in the kitchen. Exhausted. Quiet. Old. He didn't look at the bodies at his feet. He looked up, straight into the lens of camera 7. He knew she was watching. He keyed a button on his wrist gauntlet, opening a private channel to the bunker. "Perimeter secure," his gravelly voice crackled through the bunker's speaker. "You can come out now, Verney." She pressed her forehead against the cold plasteel wall of the panic room. She finally understood why the Orion Coalition had surrendered. You couldn't fight a force of nature. and you certainly couldn't beat a man who built a garden on top of a graveyard. Ash drifted through the shattered glass of the greenhouse, settling like gray snow on the ruined heirloom tomatoes. Vernie stepped out of the basement. Her simple dress immediately snagged on a jagged piece of plasteel, tearing at the hem. She didn't notice. The smell hit her the moment she crossed the threshold into the courtyard. It was a thick, suffocating mixture of ozone, scorched meat, and the sharp chemical tang of high explosives. Reed was out of the heavy armor. He wore a dark undershirt and utility trousers. He was not gloating. He was not resting. He was dragging a dead coalition soldier by the straps of his tactical vest, hauling the heavy body across the cracked pavement. He laid the man down next to 20 others in a perfectly straight line. He reached down, closing the dead man's eyes with a calloused thumb, then moved to the next body. He was treating the men who had just tried to murder him with more dignity than their own general had. Vernie walked slowly toward him. Her legs felt hollow. She looked at the faces of the dead. Some were older veterans, their faces scarred from previous campaigns. But many were young, desperately young. Boys who had grown up on a starving world, fed on propaganda and promises of glory, sent to die on a cold cliffside. "You're bleeding," she said. Her voice sounded thin and papery over the low roar of the ocean below. Reed stopped. He looked down at his right side. Dark fluid saturated the fabric of his shirt, dripping steadily onto the concrete. "Spall from the tank detonation," he said, his voice completely devoid of pain. "It missed the lung." He turned back to the wreckage, reaching for another body. "Stop!" Vernie commanded. It was the first time she had raised her voice to him. Reed paused, looking at her over his shoulder. "You are going to bleed out," she said, pointing to the dark puddle forming by his boot. "Leave them. The automated drones can do this. Where's your medical bay?" Reed stared at her for a long moment. His face was pale beneath the soot and grime. Slowly, he released the dead soldier's vest. "Sub-level 2, next to the armory." She followed him down. The medical bay was as austere as the rest of the house. Cold white lights flickered on as they entered, illuminating a stainless steel surgical table and a wall of automated diagnostic equipment. Reed sat on the edge of the table. He gripped the hem of his undershirt and pulled it over his head. Vernie caught her breath. His torso was a roadmap of violence. Burn scars mottled his left shoulder. Deep, jagged lacerations crisscrossed his chest. But the worst was the fresh wound. A piece of jagged shrapnel, 3 inches long, was embedded deep in his obliques. The skin around it was already bruising, turning a sick, deep purple. He didn't wince. He opened a sterilized drawer, pulled out a pair of heavy forceps and a cauterizing torch. He held the forceps out to her. "The med droid needs a calibration update," Reed said flatly. "It will take 10 minutes to boot." "I don't have 10 minutes." Vernie stared at the metal instrument. "I'm not a doctor." "You don't need to be. Grip the metal, pull straight out, don't twist." He handed her the torch. "Then press this to the wound. It will smell bad. Ignore it." Her hands were shaking. She took the forceps. She was the daughter of a planetary governor, raised in palaces, taught planetary economics and classical literature. She had never touched the raw, ugly reality of her world's wars. Now she was holding the bloody tools of survival. She stepped between his knees. Up close, he smelled of sweat, cordite, and old iron. She clamped the forceps onto the protruding metal. "Pull," he said. She braced herself and pulled. It was stuck. She pulled harder, gritting her teeth. With a sickening wet slide, the shrapnel came free. Blood welled up instantly, spilling over his waist. Reed didn't make a sound. His jaw just locked tight, the muscles in his neck cording like steel cables. "The torch!" he grunted. Verney dropped the shrapnel into a steel basin. It rang loudly in the quiet room. She engaged the cauterizing tool. A small blue flame hissed to life. She pressed it against the open wound. The smell of burning flesh filled the sterile air. Verney felt her stomach heave, but she held it there until the bleeding stopped, sealing the wound behind a blackened crust of tissue. She pulled the torch away, panting slightly. Reed let out a long, slow breath. He reached over with a damp cloth and wiped the sweat from his forehead. "Thank you." Verney stepped back, dropping the torch onto a tray. She crossed her arms tightly, trying to stop her hands from trembling. "Why did you do it?" she asked softly. "Why didn't you just call for orbital support? Earth Command has a fleet sitting 2 systems over. They could have glassed the forest. If I called for an orbital strike, the fleet would have wiped out the entire grid," Reed replied, wrapping a sterile bandage tightly around his waist. "And they would have used it as a pretext to nullify the peace treaty. The coalition would be declared an active hostile threat again. The embargoes would return. Your people would burn." Verney froze. "You fought 300 men in close quarters to protect my people from your own fleet?" Reed looked up at her. His pale blue eyes were unreadable. "I fought them because they were in my yard. The politics are secondary." He stood up, grabbing a clean shirt from a storage locker. "The automated defenses will handle the cleanup. Get some sleep, Verney. Tomorrow is going to be a loud day." He walked out of the medical bay, leaving her alone in the cold, bright room. She looked at the piece of bloody shrapnel in the basin. He had lied. The butcher of the Outer Rim had just risked his own life to save the very people who had sent assassins to cut off his head. High above the gray, churning oceans of New Cornwall, a single ship drifted in the silent void. It was an Orion stealth frigate, the Vanguard. Its hull was painted a deep, light-absorbing black, hiding it from the standard Terran sensor nets. On the bridge, General Gregory Hale stood rigid, his hands clasped behind his back. He was a tall, sharply dressed man, his uniform immaculate, his chest heavy with medals won in battles fought a decade ago. Right now, those medals felt incredibly heavy. The tactical holotable in the center of the room was dark. 10 minutes ago, it had been a swarm of bright green life signs. Now, it was a graveyard. "Sir," his communications officer whispered, breaking the suffocating silence on the bridge. "We've lost the final telemetry feed. Squad 7 is gone. We have no active signals on the surface." Hale closed his eyes. His throat was bone dry. 300 of his best shock troopers, heavy armor, armor-piercing kinetic weapons. They had descended on a single isolated estate held by one retired Terran officer, one man. "Did they breach the house?" Hale asked, his voice tight. "Did they confirm the traitor's death?" "No, General. They never made it past the courtyard. The target engaged them directly. It was a Mark 7 combat chassis." Hale's eyes snapped open. "A Wraith. The Terrans decommissioned those suits. The neural toll is too high for a human brain to handle. It kills the pilot." "Apparently," the officer swallowed hard. "Admiral Reed doesn't care." Hale gripped the edge of the holotable. He had planned this for months. a swift, brutal strike to eliminate Verney Turnerl. With her dead, the Terrans would lose their legitimate claim to the Coalition throne. The treaty would fracture, and the surviving Orion fleets could rally for a final, glorious stand. Instead, he had just handed Earth Command the perfect excuse to annihilate them all. He had poked a sleeping monster, and the monster had simply opened its jaws and swallowed his army whole. "Break orbit!" Hale ordered, his voice trembling slightly. "Engage silent running. Get us back to the Shadow Network before the Terran planetary sensors pick up our thermal wash." As the Vanguard slinked away into the dark, a very different conversation was happening on the surface. Morning had broken over New Cornwall. The storm had passed, leaving behind a cold, gray sky. In Reed's study, the heavy curtains were drawn shut. The room was illuminated by the harsh blue glare of a high-resolution holographic projector. Verney stood in the hallway, leaning against the cold plasteel wall, listening through the slightly ajar door. "You look like hell, Jonathan." The voice belonged to Admiral Sapphira Bailey. It was crisp, authoritative, and dripping with condescension. "I had guests," Reed's voice replied, smoothly. He was sitting at his mahogany desk, a mug of black coffee steaming in his hand. He wore a crisp black uniform, hiding the thick bandages wrapped around his torso. "We tracked the drop pods," Bailey said. The holographic projection shifted, displaying the trajectory of the Coalition attack. 300 men, a coordinated military strike. It seems your little bride's people aren't as subdued as she promised." "It was a rogue element," Reed countered. "A splinter faction loyal to Gregory Hale. They do not represent the Coalition government. They wear Coalition armor. They fly Coalition ships," Bailey barked. The hologram of the older human leaned forward, his face hardening. "The council convened an hour ago, Jonathan. This is an act of war, an unprovoked assault on a Terran planetary governor. We are authorizing a full blockade of the Orion system. Orbital bombardment of their primary shipyards begins in 48 hours. Verney pressed her hand against her mouth. Her heart slammed against her ribs. Orbital bombardment. They were going to burn billions of innocent people for the actions of one radical general. "No," Reed said. The word dropped into the room like a lead weight. Bailey paused. "Excuse me?" "I said no, Sapphira. You will not blockade the system, and you will not fire a single shot at those shipyards. You don't have the authority to countermand the council, Reed. You're retired. I am the military governor of this sector, and I am the primary signatory of the Orion Armistice," Reed said slowly. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "Under Terran military law, Section 4, Article 9, an attack on a governor's estate falls strictly under planetary jurisdiction. It is a local police matter, not a naval one." Bailey laughed harshly. "A police matter? 300 heavily armed shock troopers? They are dead," Reed said flatly. "All of them. The threat is neutralized. There is no ongoing conflict to justify fleet action." "You're protecting them," Bailey accused, his eyes narrowing. "You're protecting the people who just tried to murder you. Why? Because of the girl? Is the butcher going soft because he finally found a bed warmer?" Verney stiffened in the hallway. Her cheeks burned with humiliation. Inside the study, the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Reed did not shout. He did not slam his fist on the desk. He simply set his coffee mug down. The clink of the ceramic against the wood sounded deafening. "Watch your mouth, Sapphira," Reed whispered. The low gravel of his voice was laced with a venom Verney had never heard before. "You are speaking about my wife, a Terran citizen by marriage. Under Earth law, any aggression against her homeworld without my explicit, written consent is a violation of her sovereign rights. If the Council pushes a fleet into her system, I will consider it a hostile invasion of my jurisdiction." Bailey looked genuinely taken aback. "You would threaten Earth Command? Over a political hostage?" "She is not a hostage," Reed said. "She is my wife, and I protect what is mine. Tell the Council to stand down, Sapphira. If they want to glass the Orion system, they have to come through me. And you know exactly what that costs." Bailey stared at the hologram of the exhausted, scarred man. He remembered the reports from the Outer Rim. He remembered entire enemy armadas turned to scrap metal by the man sitting behind that desk. "You're making a mistake, Jonathan," Bailey said quietly. "I've made plenty. This isn't one of them." Reed tapped a key on his console. "End transmission." The blue light vanished. The study fell silent. In the hallway, Verney slid down the wall, pulling her knees to her chest. The cynical, cold walls she had built around her heart over the past year cracked. She wasn't a hostage. She wasn't a trophy. Jonathan Reed had married her to give her legal immunity. He had chained himself to her so that Earth Command couldn't wipe out her species. He had taken her into his home, cooked her meals, and slaughtered an army by hand, all while acting as the single, unmovable shield between her people and extinction. The door to the study opened. Reed stepped out. He looked down, surprised to see her sitting on the floor. Verney looked up at him. She saw the exhaustion lines around his eyes. She saw the slight wince as he shifted his weight, favoring his wounded side. He wasn't a monster. He was a man holding up the sky, and his arms were getting tired. "Get up," Reed said gently, offering her a calloused hand. "The floor is cold." She took his hand. It was rough, scarred, and completely steady. For the first time since she signed the treaty, Verney felt safe. Recovery was an ugly, slow process. Jonathan did not complain, but Verney saw the tight lines around his mouth when he walked. He favored his right side. He took longer to descend the stairs to the greenhouse. She stopped retreating to her portside suite. Instead, she brought her datapad to the study and sat in the high-backed leather chair opposite his mahogany desk. Initially, he seemed surprised by her presence, but he said nothing. They settled into a new, quiet rhythm. Verney started reading over his shoulder. She watched him process millions of tons of agricultural shipments, meticulously routing them past Earth Command's bureaucratic red tape and straight into the Orion sector. He was manually bypassing trade tariffs, burying the supply drops under obscure relief classifications. He was doing the job of an entire logistics division to keep her people from starving. She began taking the datapads from his desk. When he looked up, she simply said, "I know planetary economics better than you do. You're classifying the grain as Class 4 biomass. If you classify it as Class 2 synthetic fertilizer base, it circumvents the Sol Gate inspection tax." Jonathan stared at her for a long second. Then, he slid the rest of the shipping manifests across the desk. They worked together. The silence between them shifted from tense isolation to a comfortable, functional partnership. But as the weeks passed, Verney noticed a shadow creeping over him. It started with a dropped coffee mug. Jonathan was standing by the window, reviewing a security readout, when his hand simply opened. The ceramic shattered against the concrete floor, splashing hot black coffee across his boots. He didn't curse. He just stared at his left hand. The fingers were trembling. It wasn't a slight shake. It was a harsh, rhythmic spasm that he had to physically suppress by gripping his wrist with his other hand. "Are you all right?" Verney asked, standing up. "Fine," he grunted, bending down to pick up the ceramic shards. Fatigue. It wasn't fatigue. 3 days later, Verney woke to the sound of a heavy crash from the sub-basement. She threw off her blankets, ignoring the biting cold of the estate's night air, and ran down the stairs. She found him in the medical bay. Jonathan was on the floor, his back pressed against the sterile steel cabinets. He was locked in a violent seizure. His eyes were rolled back, his jaw clamped so tight she could hear his teeth grinding. His entire body convulsed wildly against the floor tiles. "Jonathan!" She slid to her knees beside him. She didn't know what to do. She grabbed his shoulders, trying to prevent his head from striking the cabinets. "Computer, medical override, initiate trauma protocols." The automated med droid descended from the ceiling, its mechanical arms whirring to life. It injected a heavy sedative directly into his neck. Within seconds, the violent convulsions slowed, then stopped. Jonathan slumped sideways, unconscious, his chest heaving as he gasped for air. Verney sat on the floor, her hands shaking, her nightgown soaked in the cold sweat from his skin. She looked up at the diagnostic monitor. She didn't need medical training to read the stark red text flashing across the screen. Warning: advanced synaptic degradation. Neural pathways, 41% compromised. Cause: repeated exposure to MK. 7 neurolink interface. Prognosis: terminal motor failure. Verney stared at the screen, the breath catching in her throat. The Mark 7 Wraith armor. Gregory Hale had been right. The Terrans had decommissioned the suits because they destroyed the human brain. The armor didn't just respond to physical movement. It wired itself directly into the pilot's nervous system, bypassing normal muscular delay to achieve that terrifying speed. Every time Jonathan put that suit on, he was burning his own synapses to ash. He had known. When he stepped into that gantry to fight 300 men, he knew it was going to kill him. He had traded pieces of his central nervous system to buy her people's safety. Verney pulled herself up. She dragged him onto the surgical table, grunting under his heavy, dead weight. She covered him with a thermal blanket. Then she walked over to the medical terminal and exported his entire diagnostic file to her personal data pad. She marched back up the stairs to the study. She bypassed the standard Terran communication arrays and activated a heavily encrypted, archaic radio frequency. It was a dead drop channel used exclusively by the Orion Coalition's surviving Royal Guard. She waited for 10 agonizing minutes, listening to the hiss of deep space static. Finally, a voice broke through. "Identify." "This is Verney Turnerl," she said, her voice hard as diamond. "Connect me to Arthur, now." There was a pause. Then, the old advisor's voice crackled through the speaker, thick with disbelief. "Verney, my lady, are you safe? Are you—" "I am fine, Arthur," she interrupted. "Listen to me very carefully. I am sending you a biometric diagnostic file. It is heavily encrypted. I need you to take it to Dr. Eris on the Capital World. The Terrans don't have the microsurgical tech to repair this kind of nerve damage, but our bioengineers do. Verney, you are asking for black market military medical support," Arthur warned, his tone shifting to a panicked whisper. If Earth Command catches us transmitting this data, or smuggling supplies to a Terran system, Earth Command isn't going to catch anything, Verney said, her eyes locked on the dark horizon outside the window. Because Jonathan Reed is currently holding a gun to their heads. If he falls, the treaty falls, and the fleet bombs our shipyards. Tell Aris I need a neuroregenerative serum synthesized and smuggled to New Cornwall within 10 days. Or there won't be a coalition left to protect. She cut the feed. She looked down at her hands. They were no longer trembling. Earth Command did not send an army to investigate Admiral Reed. They sent a bureaucrat with a gun. His name was Inspector Harrison Cole. He arrived exactly 1 week after Jonathan's seizure, stepping off a sleek diplomatic shuttle onto the estate's rain-slicked landing pad. He was flanked by a squad of 6 heavily armed military police. Cole wore an immaculate gray uniform, his boots polished to a mirror shine, his face arranged in a mask of professional concern that hid a predator's ambition. Verney watched them approach from the security monitors in the study. Jonathan was still asleep in the medical bay, his body recovering from a second, milder tremor the night before. He was in no condition to stand, let alone negotiate. Cole punched the comms button at the heavy plasteel front door. Admiral Reed, this is Inspector Cole from Earth Command Internal Affairs. Open the gate. We are here for a mandated welfare check. Verney did not buzz them in. She turned away from the monitor and walked to her closet. She didn't put on the drab gray dress she had worn since her surrender. She reached to the back of the wardrobe and pulled out a tailored suit. It was a deep midnight blue, cut in the sharp, authoritative style of Terran High Command, but finished with the subtle, elegant tailoring of an Orion aristocrat. She pulled her hair back into a tight, severe knot. She slid the silver band Jonathan had given her farther up her finger. She walked down the long corridor, her heels clicking sharply against the concrete. She bypassed the automated security locks and pulled the heavy door open herself. Cole looked surprised to see her. He quickly recovered, offering a thin, patronizing smile. Lady Turnerl, a pleasure to see you alive and well. Please step aside. I need to speak with the Admiral. Mrs. Reed, Verney corrected, her voice echoing coldly in the damp air. And the Admiral is resting. He is not receiving visitors today. Cole's smile didn't reach his eyes. I'm afraid this isn't a social call, Mrs. Reed. The Council has noted some irregularities in Admiral Reed's recent logistical reports. Furthermore, the telemetry from the localized engagement 3 weeks ago suggests the deployment of Class A restricted hardware. He took a step forward, expecting her to shrink back. Verney stood her ground. She planted herself squarely in the center of the doorway. Inspector, Verney said smoothly, you are trespassing on the private estate of a retired fleet admiral. Without a signed warrant from the High Tribunal, you have no legal authority to cross this threshold. Cole let out a dry, dismissive laugh. A warrant? You misunderstand the situation, ma'am. Admiral Reed is suspected of violating the Geneva-Sirius Accords by utilizing a Mark 7 Wraith chassis. Furthermore, our medical analysts suspect he is suffering from severe synaptic degradation. If he is mentally unfit, his command privileges and his estate revert to Earth Command. He gestured to the MPs behind him. Move her aside. 2 soldiers stepped forward, their hands reaching out to grab her shoulders. I wouldn't do that, Verney said. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't flinch. The MPs hesitated. Verney looked directly at Cole. Under Terran law, Section 4, Article 9. This estate is under the sovereign protection of its owner. However, as the legal spouse of Admiral Reed, I possess secondary command authority. If you touch me, it is an assault on a Terran citizen. If you cross this threshold without my permission, it is a hostile home invasion. You are a political ward, Cole sneered, his patience vanishing. Your marriage is a piece of paper meant to pacify your barbaric people. Do not quote my own laws to me, little girl. Verney reached into her blazer pocket. She pulled out a small black remote controller. Jonathan told me that war isn't a story. It's an equation, Verney said, her eyes locked onto Cole's. Let's do the math, Inspector. She pressed a button on the remote. A heavy, mechanical groaning echoed through the courtyard. The stone gargoyles flanking the entrance shattered outward. From beneath the masonry, twin automated Vulcan cannons emerged. Their barrels spun with a terrifying whine, locking directly onto Cole's chest. At the same time, the tree lines surrounding the landing pad shifted. 4 heavy plasma turrets rose from concealed bunkers, painting the diplomatic shuttle in bright red targeting lasers. The MPs instantly raised their rifles, but they were vastly outgunned. Cole froze, the color draining completely from his face. Admiral Reed spent 10 years anticipating an assassination attempt from disgruntled coalition loyalists. Verney lied smoothly, her voice utterly devoid of fear. He wired this entire cliffside with enough ordnance to sink a dreadnought. He transferred the vocal command codes to me yesterday. The turrets are currently set to autonomous defense mode. If you or your men advance 1 more inch, the system will classify you as a hostile breaching force and reduce you to organic vapor. Cole swallowed hard. He looked at the spinning barrels of the Vulcan cannons. He looked back at Verney. He saw the cold, unyielding iron in her eyes. It was the same look the Butcher of the Outer Rim wore before he broke a planet. You're bluffing, Cole whispered. You wouldn't murder an Earth Command inspector. Try me, Verney whispered back. Silence stretched over the courtyard, broken only by the low hum of the targeting lasers and the crashing of the ocean below. Slowly, agonizingly, Cole took a step backward. He raised his hands, gesturing for his MPs to lower their weapons. This isn't over, Mrs. Reed. The Council will hear of this. If he is hiding a Wraith suit, we will find out. Tell the Council, Verney said, her voice ringing out clearly, that my husband is enjoying his retirement. And if they send armed men to my home again, I will not bother turning on the warning lasers. She pressed the button on the remote. The heavy plasteel door slammed shut in Cole's face, the magnetic locks engaging with a definitive thud. Verney leaned her back against the door and exhaled a long, trembling breath. Her knees felt weak, but she forced herself to stay upright. She turned off the remote. A simple garage door opener Jonathan had modified to manually trigger the exterior security cameras. There were no Vulcan cannons. There were no plasma turrets in the tree line. The red lasers were just standard perimeter tripwires she had recalibrated to point outward. She walked back to the medical bay. When she entered, Jonathan was awake. He was sitting up slowly on the surgical table, holding his ribs. He looked exhausted, but his eyes were clear. He looked at her tailored suit, then at the datapad in her hand. I heard the perimeter alarms, he rasped, his voice rough. Who was it? Verney walked over to him. She didn't cower. She didn't look away. She picked up a glass of water from the tray and handed it to him. Just a salesman, Verney said quietly. I told him we weren't buying. Jonathan took the glass. He looked at her for a long time, seeing the hard shift in her posture, the quiet defiance in her jaw. The corners of his scarred mouth twitched upward in the faintest shadow of a smile. "Good," he said softly. "I hate solicitors." Fog rolled off the churning sea, swallowing the lower cliffs of New Cornwall. A heavily modified Orion skiff cut through the gray mist, its repulsor engines dialed down to a subsonic hum. It didn't broadcast a transponder code. It flew low, skimming the whitecaps to stay beneath Earth Command's planetary radar grid. Verney stood on the edge of the landing pad, a heavy wool coat wrapped tightly around her shoulders. The biting wind whipped her hair across her face, but she didn't blink. The skiff touched down with a soft hiss of displaced air. The side hatch slid open. A single figure stepped out, holding a pressurized cryo case. It was a coalition smuggler, face obscured by a breath mask, eyes darting nervously toward the automated turrets that Verney had left visibly powered up. 10 days exactly, the smuggler said, his voice distorted through the mask. He handed the case over. It was surprisingly light. Dr. Aris said to administer it immediately. It's highly unstable outside of stasis. Thank you, Verney said. She passed him a data chip containing untraceable Terran credits she had siphoned from the sector's agricultural surplus fund. Get off this rock before the patrol drones make their secondary pass. The skiff vanished back into the fog within 60 seconds. Verney carried the case down into the sub-basement. The estate was completely silent, save for the low thrum of the geothermal generators. She punched her override code into the medical bay doors. Jonathan was sitting on the edge of the surgical table. He was repairing the frayed wiring on his kinetic repeater. He didn't look up when the doors hissed open, but his hands stopped moving. You went outside, he stated. It wasn't a question. I had a delivery, Verney replied. She set the case on the stainless steel counter and popped the biometric latches. Cold vapor spilled over the edge, revealing 3 glass vials containing a viscous, luminescent green fluid. Jonathan set the rifle down. He stood up slowly, leaning heavily on the table. His left leg was trembling again. The synaptic degradation had accelerated over the past week. He couldn't hide it anymore, no matter how much black coffee he drank or how early he woke up. He looked at the vials, then at her. What is that? It's a customized neural regenerative serum, bioengineered by coalition scientists. It repairs the myelin sheaths and forces rapid cellular growth in burned synaptic pathways. Verney picked up a sterilized auto-injector from the medical tray. She carefully loaded the first vial. It will stop the tremors. It will stop the degradation. Jonathan stared at the glowing green liquid. He didn't look relieved. He looked furious. You contacted the Orion Underground, Jonathan said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. You bypassed the blockade. You used Earth Command's own communication arrays to smuggle Class 1 illegal biotics onto a Terran military estate. Yes. Do you have any idea what they will do to you if they find out? He took a step toward her. The anger in his eyes was absolute. That is high treason, Verney. They won't just execute you. They'll put you in a deep space penal colony for the rest of your life. I spent the last month trying to keep a target off your back, and you just painted a bullseye on your own chest. Verney did not step back. She met his furious gaze with cold, unwavering resolve. I did what had to be done, she said. You were dying. You were dying because you strapped yourself into a decommissioned death trap to save my life. I am not going to sit in the study and watch you vibrate to pieces. It was my choice, he snapped. And this is mine, she fired back, her voice ringing sharply against the metal walls. You don't get to be the only martyr in this house, Jonathan. You don't get to make all the sacrifices. We are a partnership. That was the deal. Now sit down and give me your arm. Jonathan stood frozen. The butcher of the Outer Rim, the man who had shattered armadas and broken 300 soldiers bare-handed, looked entirely defeated by a woman half his size holding a medical syringe. He slowly lowered himself back onto the edge of the table. He rolled up his left sleeve, exposing the thick ropes of scar tissue from past wars. Verney stepped between his knees. She swabbed the crook of his elbow with an antiseptic wipe. Dr. Aris said this is going to hurt, she warned softly. It forces the nervous system to reboot. It's going to feel like fire. I'm used to fire, Jonathan said quietly. He looked at her face, studying the sharp lines of her jaw, the dark circles under her eyes. You're a fool, Verney. I married you, she replied dryly. The bar for my decision-making was already low. A dry, rustling sound escaped his chest. It took her a second to realize he was laughing. It was a rusty, unused sound. She pressed the auto-injector against his vein and pulled the trigger. The reaction was instantaneous. Jonathan violently arched backward, his back snapping rigidly against the table. Every muscle in his body seized. The breath left his lungs in a choked, agonized hiss. His eyes rolled back, displaying only the whites, and his jaw locked with a terrifying cracking sound. Jonathan! Verney dropped the injector. She grabbed his shoulders, trying to hold him steady as violent tremors racked his massive frame. His skin turned ghostly pale, covered instantly in a thick sheen of cold sweat. He was suffocating. His diaphragm was paralyzed by the sudden, explosive reboot of his central nervous system. Breathe, she pleaded, her fingers digging into his rigid muscles. She leaned over him, pressing her forehead against his chest, listening to his wildly erratic heartbeat. Jonathan, please breathe. You don't get to die on me. I forbid it. Breathe. For 30 agonizing seconds, he was trapped in his own body. And then his chest hitched. He dragged in a massive, ragged lungful of air. His eyes snapped open, wide and bloodshot. The brutal tension drained from his muscles all at once, leaving him completely limp. He slumped forward, his head resting heavily against Verney's shoulder, panting like a dying animal. Verney held him. She wrapped her arms tightly around his broad back, burying her face in his neck. She didn't care about the sweat or the lingering smell of cordite. She felt the steady, powerful rhythm of his heart against her ribs. The violent tremors in his left arm had completely stopped. Jonathan slowly raised his hand. He flexed his fingers. They were perfectly still. He let out a long, shuddering sigh. He wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her closer, resting his weight against her. It was the first time he had truly touched her with anything resembling tenderness. Thank you, he whispered, his voice broken. Don't do it again, she whispered back, her voice shaking. Don't ever do it again. 6 months later, the political landscape of the Orion sector had entirely transformed. Earth Command had fully expected the coalition to collapse into civil war. They had expected Admiral Reed to violently pacify the region. They were wrong on both counts. Verney sat in the high-backed leather chair behind the mahogany desk in the study. She wore a tailored gray suit, a datapad resting in her lap. Across the desk sat a holographic projection of Inspector Harrison Cole. The ambitious internal affairs officer looked distinctly uncomfortable. "The trade tariffs for the third quarter are unacceptable, Mrs. Reed," Cole said, shifting his weight. "You've routed 90% of the sector's raw titanium exports exclusively to coalition shipyards. Earth Command requires a minimum 50% tithe. Earth Command signed the revised Halcyon Treaty 3 months ago, Inspector," Verney replied smoothly. She didn't look up from her datapad. Under subsection B, paragraph 4, local agricultural surplus can be traded for raw industrial materials to ensure planetary stability. My people were starving. Now they are building tractors. The titanium stays in the Orion sector. The Council feels you are overstepping your authority. They are considering deploying a localized fleet to enforce the tithe. Cole's voice carried a thinly veiled threat. Verney finally looked up. She offered him a very cold, very polite smile. "If the Council wishes to deploy a fleet, they are welcome to try," Verney said. "But I must remind you that Admiral Reed remains the military governor of this sector. If armed Terran vessels enter our airspace to seize civilian assets, he will consider it an act of piracy. And you know how my husband deals with pirates." Cole's holographic face twitched. Everyone in Earth Command knew exactly what had happened to the last 300 men who tested Jonathan Reed's patience. The official report stated it was a localized defense turret malfunction. Nobody believed the official report. "I will pass along your interpretation of the treaty to the Council," Cole muttered. "Do that. Good day, Inspector." Verney tapped the console, cutting the feed. She leaned back in her chair and let out a long breath. She had spent the last 6 months rewriting the economic foundation of her entire species. She used Earth Command's own bureaucratic laws to suffocate their control, leveraging Jonathan's terrifying reputation as an impenetrable shield. As long as the Council believed the Butcher of the Outer Rim was standing right behind her, ready to unleash hell, they wouldn't touch her. And they certainly wouldn't send another inspector to check the estate. The door to the study opened. Jonathan walked in. He moved slower than he used to. The bioserum had stopped the neural degradation, but it couldn't undo all the damage. He walked with a slight, permanent limp, relying on a polished oak cane for long distances. The Mark VII Wraith armor sat locked in the deepest vault of the basement, its power core permanently removed. He would never wear it again. He didn't need to. He wore a simple canvas shirt, his sleeves rolled up, his forearms smeared with dark soil. He carried a small woven basket. "Council giving you a headache?" Jonathan asked, limping over to the desk. "Just Cole," Verney said, her posture softening entirely as she looked at him. "He's still trying to squeeze our titanium shipments. I reminded him of your temperament." Jonathan chuckled, a warm, resonant sound. "You're turning me into a boogeyman to win trade disputes. It's highly effective." She stood up and walked around the desk. "What did you bring me?" Jonathan held out the basket. Inside sat 3 perfectly ripe, brilliant red heirloom tomatoes. "First yield from the new greenhouse soil," he said. He looked incredibly proud. The man who had once calculated the trajectories of orbital bombardments now applied that same obsessive focus to soil pH levels and hydration cycles. Verney picked one up. It was warm from the sun lamps. "They're beautiful. They're a delicate crop," Jonathan said softly. He reached out, his rough, scarred hand gently brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. His touch was warm, grounded. They require patience and a controlled environment. Verney looked up into his pale blue eyes. The exhaustion that used to haunt them was gone. The cold, mechanical soldier had vanished, leaving behind a man who finally understood how to live in the quiet. "I think we've managed to build a very controlled environment," she said, leaning into his hand. "We did," Jonathan agreed. War wasn't a story, and it wasn't an equation. It was a disease. It consumed everything it touched until there was nothing left but ash and ghosts. Verney had signed her life away to a monster to stop that disease. She had expected to be a prisoner. She had expected a gilded cage. Instead, she had found a partner, a man willing to burn his own mind to ash to keep her safe. A man who had traded his empire for a quiet cliffside and a garden. Jonathan offered his arm. Verney took it, wrapping her hands around his thick bicep. Together, they walked out of the study, moving slowly but steadily down the corridor. Outside, the gray clouds finally broke, casting a warm golden light over the churning ocean. The butcher was dead, the war was over, and the harvest was just beginning. If you felt the tension of this impossible alliance and loved watching Verney and Jonathan turn a brutal bargain into an empire of their own, hit that like button right now. It really helps the channel grow and lets me know you want more grounded, character-driven sci-fi stories just like this one. Don't forget to share this video with your fellow sci-fi fans who love a quiet badass. Subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss our weekly tales of human defiance, strategy, and survival. Drop a comment below. Would you have risked the treason to save the butcher? See you in the next one.